Okay, we're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone and thank you for tuning in today to this webinar for busy lawyers. These monthly webinars are designed to bring you practical information in just 20 to 30 minutes. And this is information that you can implement right away. Today, I had the pleasure of introducing Anne Brafford. Anne is the chairperson of the ABA Law Practice Division's Attorney Wellbeing Committee and founder of Aspire, an educational and consulting firm for the legal profession. In 2014, Anne left her job as an equity partner at Morgan Lewis after 18 years of practice to focus on thriving in the legal profession. Anne has a master's degree in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and now is a PhD student in positive organizational psychology at Claremont Graduate University, where she focuses on research related to lawyer thriving. Anne is the author of a book recently published by the ABA called Positive Professionals: Creating High-Performing, Profitable Firms Through the Science of Engagement. Before I turn it over to Anne, I'd like to let you know that we will have time at the end to take all of your questions. Simply write them into the chat box and I will relay those questions to Anne at the very end. Anne, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Susan. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
Excellent. All right, well, I'm so excited to get to talk today about one of my favorite topics, or maybe my favorite topic, lawyer thriving. And in 30 minutes, we're gonna do this power session of going through 3 quick tips for boosting health and happiness. So we're going to talk about both health and performance related tips that you can use every day. And what I would like to start with is a basic structure for thinking about resilience and well-being. And what I call the engagement burnout scale. And so we can see it up in front of us, what this scale sort of looks like. And what the idea is, and what the research shows is that our whole life systems, whether it's stuff is happening to us at work or stuff is happening to us in our home life, have an influence on our well-being. We have both stressors, or demands, and boosters or resources. And stressors are really anything that deplete us. Suck our energy away from us, either at home or at work. So things like workload, time pressures, conflicts, things that are going to naturally occur in high-achieving people's lives, like lawyers. On the other hand, are boosters, and those are things both are like our individual strengths and talents and things in our context. So like, good leadership, strong firm mission that inspires us, those sorts of things really help energize us. And the basic idea is that when you have boosters outweighing stressors, you have engagement. But when the scale gets out of whack, that's when we head toward dysfunction and burnout. So what we really want to focus on is we can't control the stressors. Those are just going to happen, especially in lawyers' lives. There's so many naturally occurring negative stuff and stress. So we really want to concentrate on how to cultivate and foster more boosters in our home and work lives so that we're more likely to head toward engagement and high functioning. And in thinking about this scale and the stressors, it's really important to realize that it's not all entirely objective. And it's one of the things that in my studies has really been striking about how much stress is influenced by our mindset. And so the actual definition of stress is that it happens when our perceived demands are greater than our perceived ability to cope. So objective reality certainly plays a role in this, but it's not determinative. And what really influences whether we feel stress or not are that other side of the scale are the boosters. So when we feel like we have a lot of resources, that we're prepared and ready for the challenge, we're less likely to experience stress. So again, we really want to focus on building those boosters. And so we're going to talk about 3 today. There's, of course, a long list of resources that science suggests can help us go more toward engagement and away from burnout. And we're going to talk about 3 today. we're going to talk about positive emotions, high quality relationships, and resilient thinking. And resilient thinking, there's a whole lot that goes on in that bucket, but we're going to talk about one strategy for resilient thinking, which is positive challenge mindset. So let's start with tip number one, which is to prioritize positivity. So the idea of positive emotions. And here's a list just in case you're not sure what positive emotions means. So here's a list of some of the positive emotions that occur in everyday life. And the science of positive emotions is still relatively new, really kind of taking hold in the 80s, because what had happened is historically in science, all the focus had been on negative emotions for, good and obvious reasons. That one, they were obvious. It was obvious as to why they were important from an evolutionary standpoint. Negative emotions create really strong action tendencies. So, when we feel fear or threat, we have a reaction to run or flee. And negative emotions are also big contributors to things like depression and maladaptive functioning. And so, of course, science wanted to focus on those because we knew that they were harmful to people, and science wanted to try to alleviate that harm. So positive emotions were just sort of left alone, that the science really wasn't sure what they were for, whether they had an evolutionary reason, and whether they had an effect. So then science comes in, so a couple of scientists finally started studying it and found that, yes, positive emotions are as important and as adaptive as negative emotions. Negative emotions were really important to keep us alive through the evolutionary cycle, so that we don't die. So then positive emotions, what their function was, okay, so here we are alive, how do we build and grow? So while negative emotions will sort of, shut us down and make us flee, what positive emotions do is they have an effect on our thinking and our cognitions, so that we are prompted to be more creative, to build, to want to reach out to others. So what their function was then, in times of safety, that we would build and connect so that we would create structures and cultures that we could survive then in the future when bad stuff happens. We have taken this time to really be creative and build and connect. So it turns out that positive emotions are as important as negative emotions, but sort of in popular society, they're still not getting enough attention, that people know maybe that negative emotions are bad, but don't focus enough on prioritizing positivity in their lives. And I think this, in my experience, I practiced law for about 20 years, that it was especially true, I thought, for lawyers, that we have so many naturally occurring negative things that happen in our work, especially, things like the judge's ruling goes against you, or, doesn't care about your vacation, opposing counsel is nasty, your colleagues aren't helpful. Like, all of these things that naturally happen mean that lawyers might have to do a better job, or at least more mindfully, building and developing positive emotions into their daily lives to avoid dysfunction. And what the research shows is that folks that have a positive emotional style, which means a tendency toward positivity, they just basically have better health, happiness, resilience. Like, all the good things that we want in our work and home lives are improved when we tend toward positive emotions. So that's like 50 to 80% of the time we're tipped up toward the positive side. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily, enthusiastic. These aren't the sorts of positive emotions that, you might experience bungee jumping. It's just what the science suggests is it's just mild, positive more than negative, has an enormous impact on our health and happiness. And the idea of the positive tendency implicates the positivity ratio, which has its own line of research. And what piles of research show is that bad or negative emotions are stronger than good. And this makes sense. Like, as I was emphasizing, negative emotions have this really important evolutionary function of keeping us alive. And positive emotions were important, but if we missed an opportunity to connect or be creative, we probably weren't going to die. But if we misconstrued or misinterpreted a threat, we were more likely to be dead. And so the way that we are now wired is that negative emotions are about 3 times as strong as positive emotions. They more powerfully affect our emotions. They stick with us. We tend to ruminate about them more. And so it's important to really think about all the negative stuff that's naturally happening. We want to try to be more deliberate in making sure that we get more positivity into our days so that we're experiencing about, 3 to 1. I know it's hard to keep track, like, was that negative or was that positive? But the idea is just to try to be more intentional and deliberate about getting more positivity into our days because of the negative impact and the stronger negative impact that negative emotions have. And one of the important impacts that positive emotions have is it affects our information processing. So when we're feeling a little bit more positive than negative, we naturally have a more optimistic lens. And the opposite is true for negative emotions. So when we're experiencing negative emotions, we tend to be more pessimistic about ourselves and our abilities, about other people and their intentions, about the world in general. Where when we have more positive emotions, it broadens our thinking, opens our minds, more creative problem solving. So all these good things that make us more approach oriented in our days. And so then it probably won't surprise you that what the research shows is that it's not just that success causes happiness, but happiness causes success. And here's a list of, a short list of the long list that science has shown that happiness contributes to. And when I say happiness, I'm talking about this positive emotional style, where it's just more likely than not, you're experiencing mild positive emotions. And because it has this effect on our information processing, we're more optimistic toward others, we're more likely to connect. And so others reciprocate that. We're more likely to be liked, we're more influential, we're seen as better leaders when we have this more positive emotional style. So it's both that it helps us be more healthy, and it also helps us be more successful in our professional and home lives. So because positive emotions are so important, what I suggest as this first tip is to plan positivity. And there's research on what this means, on what planning positivity means. And what the research has shown is that we can't will ourselves to be happiness. Like, we can't just sit in our chair and think happiness is really important, Anne told me so I'm going to feel happy. That often backfires because we just can't make ourselves, feel emotions. But what does work is to deliberately go about our day, like plan days in advance, whether you do weekly planning, every other day planning, but really think about opportunities that for you will lead to naturally occurring positive emotions. And so one of the, in the studies of this idea of prioritizing positivity, one of the important questions that really is an indicator of whether you tend toward this prioritization of positivity is how you answer a priority for me is experiencing happiness in everyday life. We want to get ourselves into a position where we're saying that, yes, that's us. We rank that high because that means we're really more deliberately thinking about positive emotions. And what the research also shows is that some kinds of activities are better than others. So, like eating pizza and watching TV can, probably sort of make us feel kind of, happy sometimes, sort of positive emotions. But those sorts of things don't contribute as well to these good outcomes that we've been listing. So what the research shows is things that really have this good impact on our well-being are when they satisfy our basic psychological needs. So the first is connecting with others. Social interactions, positive social interactions are one of the best ways to boost positive emotions. So thinking about, in your days, are you eating at your desk, or, are you finding someone to go to lunch with? Do you go walk alone, or do you ask someone to go with you? I know, when I was practicing, and even now that I'm a researcher and student, so often when I get busy, which is often, one of the first things to go by the wayside are my relationships. And I've really learned through the science that it's really shooting myself in the foot because it's harming my functioning by being too isolated and being too alone. So really thinking about ways of getting, positive interactions into our days. The second is mastery experiences. So like anything that makes you feel like you're learning and growing, whether it's something work related or I think, something like learning to play an instrument, learning a language, anything where you feel like you're growing and developing has a really big boost for our positive emotions. And then last is, the choice of our activities to really boost positive emotion should be autonomous. That there are things that we want to do. They're aligned with our interests and our values. So if most of what we do on our weekends is just, a to-do list of what other people want us to do, those are important and we need to get those things done too. But we also need to make sure that we do things that are aligned with our own interests and values, because that's really what boosts positive emotions. So the next tip is to prioritize people, which, our last tip got into a little bit. And the research really is overwhelming on the importance of good relationships to our functioning, to our well-being and our professional and individual functioning. And so I can't really emphasize enough how important it is to prioritize people in your lives. And what I have up here, just some of the research shows having high quality relationships contribute to. So longevity, like we live longer, reduced depression and anxiety, more likely to attain our goals, better health, more meaningfulness in our lives. Like all of these things that are so important to both our happiness, and our optimal functioning at work, high quality relationships contribute to. And there was, some of you may have seen that there was a recent study that came out, the ABA was publicizing it, showing that lawyers rank the highest of all the professions that were studied on the loneliness scale. And so I think it's especially true for folks in really small firms or solo practitioners. Especially, I think we all need to think about prioritizing people, but especially if you're in a situation where if you don't make it a priority and really think about during your days, you could spend all day alone. You could spend all week alone. I'm sort of in that situation myself, that I'm a researcher and a student. So, I'm home in a quiet office all day, reading and, and writing. And so we really need to think about, although, I really get caught up in my work, it's so important to connect, both for my health and my optimal functioning. And so not letting that go by the wayside. Okay, so tip 3 is the idea of, flexible mindset, resilient mindset, and we're going to talk specifically about the positive challenge mindset. And what research shows is that people tend to have one of two stress mindsets. And what stress mindset is our habits of thinking when we're having stressful experiences or potential stressful experiences. So on the one hand, one group of people really view stress as enhancing their performance. Like they see the positive side of stress, that if I'm in a stressful situation, it must mean that something good is happening, that I'm being challenged. But the majority of people, that's not their habits of thinking about stress. They think of stress more as depleting their health and vitality and their performance, and that makes sense. Like that's really what the media has emphasized to us, is that stress can kill you, which it can. Stress has both good and bad aspects to it, and I really want to emphasize the good aspects, because there's been so much emphasis on the harmful aspects of stress that people actually become afraid of stress, which makes it more stressful. So we want to talk about some ways of why stress actually is good for us, and how we can use it, actually sort of harness it to help us function in a better way. So what the research shows is this, the stress mindset we have actually affects our physiological response to stress. So, the chemicals and hormones in our bodies have a different effect depending on what we think about in a challenging situation. So there, almost everybody, there was a study of Americans asking the question, like, what should you do if you're getting into a stressful situation? So like sort of a performance situation where you're going to argue in court or have an important client meeting or a pitch meeting, something like that. And you're starting to feel jitteries, butterflies. What should you do? Just about everyone says you should try to calm down. So a Harvard researcher decided, she was going to investigate this. Was this really the best approach to stress, to try to calm down? And she did sort of a series of what I think are fun studies to test this question. So she did a couple of things. One was she had people come in and sing Journey's Don't Stop Believin' on a Wii karaoke machine. And the second one was to have people prepare quickly for an impromptu speech, where they then had to speak for a few minutes in front of strangers who stared blankly at them and gave them no positive feedback, which has been shown in many studies that that's very stressful for everybody. And then the third thing she did was to have people do what she called a math test that she said was predictive of their IQ, which actually wasn't true. It was just designed to make people nervous. And she asked them to count backward from 100 by 7. And in each of the situations, she had, some people told themselves to calm down. Other people told themselves to, just accept, I just feel anxious, like just accept it. Another group of folks said, I'm excited. That's what they said to themselves, either to themselves or out loud. I'm excited, I'm excited, I'm excited. And what the research found that in all of those conditions, the folks who said, I'm excited, performed better than all of the other conditions. So saying, calm down didn't harm people's performance, but it didn't help them either. And the reason for this is that being like sort of in this activated sort of a situation where you're feeling the jittery kind of butterflies in your stomach, that is more like excitement than it is like calmness. So we can shift this potential threat mindset of fear more easily into a positive challenge mindset of excitement than we can to calm down. And what they've done a number of studies in addition to the ones that I just named, and also took people's blood and other physiological feedback readings to find out what was going on, that why was performance actually different when people said, I'm excited. And what they found is that there's actually a different mix of hormones. So things like adrenaline, endorphins, testosterone, all of these things that influence whether we feel powerful and confident or not, there was a different mixture for people who were able to shift into the positive challenge mindset by saying, I'm excited. So what that means is like all the situations that we come into as lawyers of really trying to take a moment to pull ourselves together and don't ignore it. What the research suggests is if we ignore it and don't really fully acknowledge that, oh, I'm feeling jittery, you're more likely to shift into threat mindset. So we want to sort of embrace it like, oh, okay, there it is. I'm feeling kind of jittery. I'm excited. So that you can consciously get shifted into the positive challenge mindset and potentially have all these good benefits of the better physiological response. So let's see, is there anything else I want to say about that quickly? I have so much to say on these issues. So one thing that I'll add about this before we end is just to also fold in the idea of relationships into stress mindset. So there's a group of studies about asking people to estimate the steepness of hills, which are kind of fun and fascinating, what scientists figure out how to test different human responses. So in one of the studies, they had at the University of Virginia, students were coming by, a couple of researchers stopped them at the bottom of the hill and said, hey, will you estimate the steepness of the hill? And they asked people both alone and together, so alone or in pairs, to estimate the steepness of the hill. And what they found is that folks who were with other people estimated the steepness of the hill as being less steep. And the better the relationship, the less steep was the estimate. They did a similar study where they asked only people who were alone. They weren't with anyone. And they asked one group of people to think about a specific situation where someone you cared about supported you, was supportive of you. They asked the other group of folks to think about someone who they cared about who had betrayed them. And what they found is that the folks who brought to mind the example of a person they cared about supporting them, estimated the hill as less steep. And so I think this is, again, in thinking about going into these challenging situations, of thinking I'm excited and also taking a minute to think about supportive others. Because we think about this metaphorically, right? That when we feel supported by others, the metaphorical hills are less steep. That it actually feels like we have more resources, we're better able to handle the challenge in front of us. So I'm excited and think about supportive others are two great ways to get yourself into the positive challenge mindset. And we'll post the slides. These are just a couple of ideas of things that are out there on the internet. And then my book, of course, where you can read more about both individual resilience strategies and how, as leaders in our organizations, we can help cultivate and foster the resilience of others that we work with. So hopefully you've learned in the 3 quick tips, you learned something that you can use today in your practice to be more resilient.
Anne, thank you so much. This was such an excellent presentation. You really gave us a lot to think about. I want to encourage people to post your questions in the chat box if you have them. Anne's here to answer them. So one thing that I was wondering about is that, so often lawyers are, faced with something immediately, as you were saying earlier. It could be a bad result, it could be an angry client, it could be anything. What can they do in the moment to turn around how they're feeling?
There's a couple of things, and I think the number one thing is it sort of depends on how serious it is. That this is really where mindfulness comes into play and why so many people are advocating mindfulness, because it helps build the muscle of separating ourselves from our thoughts. That a main reason why we get, anxious and upset and ruminate is because we become bonded with our thoughts. We are our thoughts. And so we want to exercise the muscle of separating ourselves from our thoughts. So if something, bad happens, we don't just go down the rabbit hole and continue to feel negativity, which can harm our health. So if we're able to exercise that muscle, then what we're able to do is create space between that initial emotional reaction, which we can't really stop. That's going to happen when something negative happens. But when we create space between that negative reaction and our behavior, we get more choice in our lives. We get to decide whether to continue to ruminate about it, or to react negatively, or decide, is it just mental garbage that I can immediately let go? And that's a lot of what happens in our daily lives. It's not that important. It's just something that irritated us. So some things can just be, there it is. Of course my mind is going to the negative. That's what our minds do. Our minds are trying to keep us safe. And so they immediately have negative thoughts, but it doesn't really mean anything. So I let it go. But if it is important and kind of stays with you, then you can go into, some mental habits of thinking about reframing it, of trying to assume the good intentions of other people rather than assuming the bad intentions, and going through some activities of putting yourself, looking at it in a more optimistic way. Since reality really is malleable, we don't always know why people behave the way that they did. And then there's just distraction, that sometimes if it's so emotionally powerful, going for a walk and not thinking about it for a while is the best thing to do until our emotions calm down a little bit. So that's a couple of ways to respond, kind of depending on the seriousness of what happened.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We have another question. How can the culture of the law school experience be made more positive?
That's a whole nother webinar that will need to be more than 30 minutes. But I think, so in the book, my book, Positive Professionals, one of the main kind of pillars I use for building positive organizations is a motivational theory called self-determination theory. And it's been applied in both law schools and lots of other educational institutions as well. And Larry Krieger is a researcher at FSU who's done a lot of research on self-determination theory applied in a law school setting. So it's things like autonomy support for individuals. So what often happens with law students is they get caught up in the value system of, oh, we need to, successful law students always go into big firm jobs, or something like that. And their values actually start shifting based on feeling compelled by their environment rather than staying true to themselves. And so there's ways that, Larry talks about in his papers and I talk about in my book of how do leaders, and in the case of educational institutions, it's either the professors in the room or the other administrators, how do you create a culture where people aren't feeling threatened, that the environments are more supportive of choice, and not feeling threatened that if they don't do well, that lowers their self-worth. It's a really big question. I don't think I've answered it very well, but I think it's because the question's a little bit too big. But I would really recommend Larry Krieger's work is all available online. And so I would suggest looking at some of his studies because I think there's some of the best work in this area.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. That was great. And thank you for sharing your time and advice with us. We really appreciate it. We'll be providing a recording and slides on our website, which is www.masslowmap.org. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and please mark your calendars for next month's webinar on June 13th, when Sam Glover, the founder of Lawyerist, will join us with his scorecard for successful small firms. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in today, and have a terrific afternoon.